The cloth eye socket was empty when Karen first noticed it at 3 in the morning. She pressed her face against the bedroom window, breath fogging the glass as she stared at the fence below. The doll she had carefully stitched that afternoon hung limp in the moonlight. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The button eye she had sewn with such meticulous hatred was gone, leaving behind a dark hole that seemed to stare back at her. "What the hell?" she whispered, her fingers clawing at the windowsill. The other dolls swayed gently in the night breeze, their fabric bodies stuffed with newspaper and malice. Each one bore a carefully embroidered name across its bloated chest: Jason, Melissa, Tommy, David, Sarah, 5 children she despised with every fiber of her being. As she watched, the eyeless doll turned its head toward her window. Karen stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. Impossible. The thing was made of scraps and spite. Nothing more. But the movement had been deliberate, purposeful, aware. Her hands flew to her arms as a burning sensation spread across her skin. In the pale moonlight filtering through her bedroom, she could see them forming, thin red lines crisscrossing her flesh like stitches, as if invisible needles were threading through her very soul. 3 days earlier, Karen Whitmore had been the picture of suburban authority. Her perfectly manicured lawn stretched like a green carpet before her colonial home on Maple Street. Every blade of grass regulation height, according to the Homeowners Association guidelines she had helped draft. As vice president of the Willowbrook Community HOA, she took her duties seriously. Too seriously. Some whispered behind perfectly painted shutters. The trouble began with a flyer that arrived in her mailbox on a Tuesday morning. Bright yellow paper announced a body positivity picnic for kids scheduled for the community park. Karen's perfectly penciled eyebrows furrowed as she read the details. Local mothers had organized the event for children facing weight-related bullying. They planned activities focused on self-acceptance, healthy habits, and community support. "Absolutely not," Karen muttered, crumpling the flyer in her manicured fist. "This neighborhood has standards." She had moved to Willowbrook specifically for its image. Property values depended on maintaining certain expectations. And those expectations did not include celebrating what she viewed as poor parenting and lack of discipline. In her mind, childhood obesity was a moral failing that deserved shame, not support. That evening, Karen called an emergency meeting with the other HOA board members. She sat at the head of her dining room table, legal pads and community bylaws spread before her like battle plans. Board President Harold Martinez arrived first, followed by Treasurer Linda Chen and Secretary Bob Thompson. They settled into her antique chairs with the wariness of people who knew Karen's moods. "We have a situation," Karen announced, sliding copies of the flyer across the polished mahogany. "This event threatens the very foundation of what we've built here." Harold adjusted his glasses, scanning the yellow paper. "It's just a picnic, Karen. The community center lawn isn't technically under HOA jurisdiction for resident events." "It's not about jurisdiction," Karen snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. "It's about image, message. What kind of community are we advertising to potential buyers? One that coddles weakness." Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "These are children, Karen. Some of them have medical conditions. My nephew Jason is participating. He has hypothyroidism." The mention of Jason Reeves made Karen's jaw clench. The 12-year-old boy lived 3 houses down with his grandmother, and his condition had caused significant weight gain despite medication. She had watched him struggle to ride his bike, had seen the way other children sometimes pointed and whispered. Rather than feeling sympathy, Karen saw only a reflection of declining neighborhood standards. "Medical condition or not," Karen said, her voice cold as winter rain, "we cannot endorse this kind of celebration. What's next? Participation trophies for everyone, Safe spaces in the playground. Bob Thompson cleared his throat nervously. The event is private, organized by parents. We don't really have grounds to interfere. Karen's eyes flashed with dangerous determination. Perhaps not officially, but there are other ways to send a message. After the board members left, Karen sat alone in her pristine kitchen, fluorescent lights humming overhead. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Her husband had left her 2 years ago, citing her increasing obsession with control and judgment. Her adult children called only on holidays, conversations strained and brief. The HOA had become her entire world, her sole source of purpose and power. That night, she couldn't sleep. Ideas churned in her mind like storm clouds gathering strength. By morning, she had formulated a plan that would send an unmistakable message to every parent planning to attend the body positivity event. Karen drove to 3 different craft stores, paying cash to avoid creating a paper trail. She purchased fabric in various colors, stuffing material, embroidery thread, needles, and buttons. The elderly clerk at the 3rd store smiled warmly as she rang up the supplies. Making dolls for the grandchildren, the woman asked pleasantly. Something like that, Karen replied, her smile cold as Arctic wind. She spent the entire Saturday in her basement craft room, windows covered with heavy curtains. Her fingers worked with fevered precision, creating 5 crude dolls designed to mock the children who would attend the picnic. Each doll was deliberately oversized, stuffed until the fabric strained at the seams. She embroidered names across their chests in angry red thread, making each letter as bold and ugly as her intentions. Jason's doll was the largest, crafted with particular cruelty. She had researched his medical condition online, studying photos of children with hypothyroidism to make her mockery more accurate. The fabric face bore button eyes that seemed to stare accusingly from the work table. As she sewed, Karen muttered under her breath, "Shame them into action. Make them face reality. Stop enabling failure." The words became a mantra, her stitches growing more violent with each repetition. Sunday morning arrived gray and overcast, matching Karen's mood perfectly. She dressed in her best HOA meeting attire, navy blazer and pressed slacks, as if preparing for official business. At dawn, while the neighborhood still slept, she carried the 5 dolls to the community fence that bordered the entrance to Willowbrook. One by one, she hung them from the wrought iron posts with plastic zip ties. Each doll faced inward toward the community, their grotesque forms visible to anyone entering or leaving the subdivision. She stepped back to admire her handiwork, satisfaction warming her chest like expensive whiskey. "Let's see how confident you feel now," she whispered to the morning air. But Karen's plan extended beyond simple public humiliation. She had prepared a social media campaign designed to amplify the shame. Using her phone, she photographed each doll from multiple angles, crafting posts that tagged the children's parents and included hashtags like Yidi Reality Check and Yidi Tough Love. Her first post went live at 8 a.m., just as families would be checking social media over breakfast. The image showed Jason's doll prominently displayed, with a caption that read, "When we celebrate obesity, instead of addressing it, who really suffers the children? Sometimes love means saying the hard truths." Willowbrook standards shook Parenting Matters. Within an hour, her phone buzzed with notifications. Angry comments flooded her posts. Parents demanded she remove the dolls immediately. Several threatened legal action. But for every outraged response, Karen felt vindicated. She was forcing a conversation the community needed to have. Linda Chen was the first to confront her directly. The treasurer appeared at Karen's front door around 10 a.m., her usually composed demeanor cracked with fury. "Take them down. Karen. Right now." Linda's voice shook with barely controlled rage. "My nephew is in tears. Do you understand what you've done? Karen crossed her arms, blocking the doorway with her body. I understand that someone needed to address the elephant in the room. Multiple elephants. Actually, those are children. Karen. Vulnerable children with feelings and struggles you couldn't possibly comprehend. What I comprehend is declining property values and a community that's lost its way. Karen replied coldly. Sometimes, leadership requires making unpopular decisions. Linda stepped closer, her eyes blazing. This isn't leadership. This is cruelty. And it stops now, or I'm calling the police. The dolls are on community property. Well within my rights as an HOA officer. Karen said with smug satisfaction. Check the bylaws section 12. Subsection 4. Community displays for educational purposes. As Linda stormed away, Karen felt a moment of doubt flicker through her chest. But she pushed it down, buried it beneath layers of righteous indignation and wounded pride. She had committed to this course of action, and Karen Whitmore never backed down. The rest of Sunday passed in a blur of angry phone calls and hostile encounters. Parents drove by slowly, pointing at the dolls and shaking their heads in disgust. Several neighbors knocked on her door, demanding explanations she refused to provide. Karen had disconnected her landline and put her cell phone on silent, but she could see the notifications piling up like digital tumbleweeds. As evening approached, she positioned herself at her bedroom window to monitor the fence. Part of her expected vandalism, perhaps angry parents attempting to remove her display under cover of darkness. But the dolls hung undisturbed, swaying gently in the autumn breeze like grotesque wind chimes. Around 10 p.m., she noticed a figure walking slowly along the fence line. An elderly black woman moved with the careful gait of someone carrying invisible weight. She stopped in front of each doll, studying them intently before moving to the next. Even from her second-story window, Karen could see the woman's lips moving, as if she were speaking to the crude fabric forms. The woman paused longest in front of Jason's doll. She reached into a cloth bag and withdrew something small, placing it carefully at the base of the fence post. Then, she continued her slow circuit, leaving similar offerings beneath each doll. Karen squinted through the darkness, trying to identify the mysterious visitor. As the woman passed beneath a streetlight, recognition dawned with uncomfortable clarity. Mama Celeste Reeves, Jason's grandmother, the woman who had moved to Willowbrook 2 years ago to help care for her grandson after his parents died in a car accident. Celeste was known throughout the neighborhood as a gentle soul who baked cookies for new residents and maintained a spectacular garden behind her modest house. She spoke with a soft, low-country accent that hinted at South Carolina roots, and she always wore a small leather pouch around her neck that she touched when nervous. What Karen didn't know, what none of the neighbors knew, was that Celeste Reeves carried knowledge passed down through 5 generations of Gullah women. Her great-great-grandmother had been born on St. Helena Island, where African spiritual traditions had survived and evolved in the isolation of the Sea Islands. Celeste had learned the old ways as a child, studying roots and rituals that could heal or harm, protect or punish. As Celeste completed her circuit of the fence, she looked directly up at Karen's bedroom window. Their eyes met across the darkness, and Karen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. The old woman's gaze held knowledge and power that made Karen's suburban authority seem as fragile as tissue paper. Celeste raised one weathered hand, pointing a gnarled finger at Karen's window. Her lips moved in words Karen couldn't hear, but somehow felt in her bones. Then, the old woman turned and walked away, leaving behind only the small offerings and the weight of consequences Karen couldn't yet comprehend. That night, Karen's sleep was restless and filled with strange dreams. She found herself in a vast sewing room where needles flew through the air like angry hornets, threading themselves through shadows and whispers. In the dream, Her fingers bled as she tried to cut the threads, but they multiplied faster than she could sever them. She woke at 3 a.m. with her heart racing and her hands cramping as if she had been sewing for hours. That's when she noticed the missing button eye, the impossible turning of the doll's head, and the burning lines that appeared across her skin like surgical scars. Monday morning brought no relief. Karen's arms and shoulders were covered in thin red marks that looked exactly like stitching patterns. They didn't hurt, but they burned with constant low-grade fire that made concentration impossible. She covered them with long sleeves and tried to convince herself it was stress-related eczema. But deep down, she knew better. At the fence, she discovered that all 5 dolls had lost their button eyes overnight. Small piles of herbs, stones, and what looked like bone fragments surrounded each fence post. The offerings Celeste had left were arranged in perfect circles, creating patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when Karen wasn't looking directly at them. "Vandalism," she muttered, but her voice lacked conviction. She tried to kick the offerings away, but her foot stopped inches from the nearest circle, as if hitting an invisible barrier. That afternoon, Harold Martinez called an emergency HOA meeting. Karen arrived to find the entire board waiting in the community center conference room, their faces grave with shared concern and barely contained anger. "This ends now, Karen," Harold said without preamble. "The dolls come down today, or we're voting to remove you from the board." Karen took her usual seat at the head of the table, but her authority felt diminished, as if the room itself rejected her presence. "You're overreacting to a legitimate community awareness campaign." "Awareness campaign?" Linda's voice rose to nearly a shout. "You've traumatized children. Karen, Jason hasn't left his house since yesterday. His grandmother had to take him to a counselor." The mention of Celeste made Karen's newly stitched scars burn hotter. She pulled her blazer sleeves down further, hiding the evidence of whatever was happening to her body. "Sometimes medicine tastes bitter," Karen replied, but her words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "I'm trying to help these families face reality." Bob Thompson slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "Reality. You want to know about reality? My daughter Melissa hasn't eaten anything but crackers since she saw that thing with her name on it. She's 10 years old. Karen. 10. The weight of their collective anger pressed down on Karen like a physical force. For the first time since hanging the dolls, she felt a crack in her certainty. But pride and stubbornness had always been her defining traits. And she couldn't back down now without admitting she was wrong. Admitting she was the monster they all believed her to be. "The dolls stay up until the body positivity event is canceled," she declared, crossing her arms despite the burning sensation the movement caused. "That's my final decision." Harold's face went white with fury. "Then consider yourself removed from all HOA duties, effective immediately. We'll be calling an emergency community vote to remove you from the board entirely." As Karen left the meeting, she felt the foundation of her carefully constructed world crumbling beneath her feet. But the alternative was surrender, and Karen Whitmore had never surrendered anything in her life. That evening, she stood guard at her bedroom window again, watching the fence with paranoid intensity. The eyeless dolls hung like accusatory ghosts in the streetlight glow. Around midnight, she heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Singing, soft and low, drifting up from the fence line like smoke from dying embers. The melody was nothing she recognized, but it felt ancient, older than the subdivision, older than the city itself. Words in a language that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to some primitive part of her brain. She pressed her face against the window glass, breath fogging the surface as she strained to see the source. The dolls were moving now, not swaying with the wind, but turning slowly on their plastic ties, rotating to face her house in perfect unison. No, 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 Karen whispered, backing away from the window. But she couldn't look away, as 5 fabric heads turned toward her, like sunflowers following the sun. A sound from her garage made her jump, scratching, as if small fingers were clawing at wood. Karen grabbed a flashlight from her nightstand and crept downstairs, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. The garage was dark and smelled of motor oil and dust. Karen's flashlight beam danced across familiar shapes her car, storage boxes, gardening tools. But something was wrong. Different. Objects had been moved, rearranged into patterns she didn't recognize. Her sewing supplies were scattered across the concrete floor in perfect circles, needles pointing inward like compass roses. Thread had been unspooled and woven between the rafters in complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Then she heard it. A child's voice, thin as spider silk, echoing from the shadows between the ceiling beams. Don't stitch what you don't understand. Karen spun around, flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Who's there? This is private property. The voice came again, seeming to move around the garage like a living thing. You sewed our pain into cloth. Now your pain sews itself into you. Karen's hands began to shake uncontrollably. The tremors started as barely perceptible twitches, but quickly escalated into violent spasms that made holding the flashlight impossible. It clattered to the concrete floor, beam spinning wild shadows across the walls. In the chaotic light, she saw them, 5 small figures standing in the corners of the garage, translucent and shimmering like heat mirages. They looked exactly like the children she had mocked, but their eyes were hollow voids that seemed to pull light and hope into their depths. We didn't ask for this burden. Jason's voice whispered from everywhere and nowhere. But you gave it to us anyway, sewed our shame into existence. Karen tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The stitched lines across her skin were spreading, multiplying, creating a web of red threads that bound her in place like invisible rope. Please, she gasped, though she wasn't sure what she was asking for. Forgiveness seemed too much to hope for. Understanding was beyond her reach. Perhaps just mercy, though she had shown none herself. The spectral children began to fade, their voices joining in harmonies that made Karen's bones ache with longing and regret. What you sow, you reap. What you bind, binds you. What you shame, shames you. As dawn approached, Karen found herself collapsed on the garage floor, surrounded by the chaos of disturbed sewing supplies. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but the thread marks across her skin had darkened to angry purple welts. She pulled herself upright and stumbled back to the house, mind reeling with questions she couldn't answer and fears she couldn't face. But as she passed her kitchen window, movement at the fence caught her attention. Celeste Reeves stood among the dolls, her weathered hands moving in complex patterns as she spoke words that carried on the morning air like prayers or curses. The old woman's eyes met Karen's through the window, and this time, Karen saw not just power, but profound sadness. Celeste shook her head slowly, as if disappointed by something she had hoped wouldn't come to pass. Then she turned and walked away, leaving behind dolls that had somehow regained their button eyes during the night. Tuesday brought a brief respite from the supernatural torment, but Karen's physical condition continued to deteriorate. The thread marks had spread to cover her entire torso, creating patterns that looked like a crude map of suffering. She called in sick to her part-time job at the insurance office, claiming a stomach virus. Around noon, she received a phone call that changed everything. Linda Chen's voice was carefully controlled, but Karen could hear the underlying current of satisfaction. The community vote is scheduled for Thursday evening, Linda announced. 7 p.m. at the community center. We have more than enough signatures to remove you from the board. You can't do this, Karen protested, though she knew they absolutely could. "I have rights as an elected official. You forfeited those rights when you chose cruelty over community." Linda replied coldly, "The dolls come down before Thursday. Or, we're also filing harassment charges against you personally." After hanging up, Karen sat in her pristine living room, surrounded by the material success she had accumulated over decades of careful planning and ruthless ambition. But none of it mattered anymore. The community she had tried to control was rejecting her completely. That evening, desperation drove her to research everything she could find about Gullah traditions and spiritual practices. What she discovered in online articles and academic papers filled her with a cold terror that had nothing to do with supernatural phenomena. The Gullah people had preserved African spiritual traditions through centuries of slavery and persecution. Their root work combined ancestral knowledge with Christian faith and Native American influences, creating a powerful system of protection and justice. Practitioners like Celeste could channel spiritual forces that existed far beyond Karen's suburban understanding of reality. More disturbing was what she learned about conjure dolls and sympathetic magic. By creating the crude effigies and naming them after specific children, Karen had unknowingly performed a form of hoodoo working. Her hatred and intent had given the dolls spiritual significance, connecting them to their targets in ways that transcended physical reality. But the real revelation came in an academic paper about protective rituals. According to Gullah tradition, children were especially vulnerable to spiritual attack, so elders often created shields and wards to guard them from harm. When someone attempted to breach those protections, the defensive magic would turn back on the attacker with multiplied force. Karen realized with growing horror that she hadn't just attacked 5 children. She had assaulted spiritual defenses that Celeste had carefully maintained around her grandson and his friends. The thread marks on her skin weren't random supernatural punishment. They were the grandmother's protective magic, turning Karen's own malicious intent back on herself. Wednesday night brought the worst supernatural manifestation yet. Karen woke to find her bedroom filled with the sound of dozens of sewing machines running at full speed. The noise was deafening. Metal needles striking fabric in rapid-fire percussion that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. She stumbled to the window, hands pressed over her ears, and saw something that made her knees buckle with terror. The 5 dolls had multiplied. Dozens of crude fabric figures now hung from every available surface on the community fence, all bearing her own face and form. Each doll was grossly exaggerated, emphasizing her worst features and personality traits. One had enormous hands clutching miniature papers labeled HOA bylaws. Another sported an oversized mouth frozen in permanent criticism. A third bore thread marks identical to those spreading across Karen's real skin. As she watched in paralyzed fascination, the Karen dolls began to move in unison, their fabric arms pointing accusingly at her bedroom window. Their button eyes glowed with reflected streetlight, creating the illusion of genuine malevolent intelligence. The sewing machine sounds reached a crescendo that shattered her bedroom windows. Glass fragments rained down on her bare feet, but Karen barely noticed. She was transfixed by the sight of her own effigy being torn apart by invisible hands, stuffing scattered to the wind like digital snow. When dawn finally arrived, the fence was empty again. Only the original 5 children's dolls remained, hanging in their designated spots as if nothing had happened. But Karen's bedroom floor was covered with fabric scraps that looked exactly like the clothing she had worn the previous day. Thursday evening arrived with the weight of inevitable judgment. Karen stood before her bathroom mirror, trying to apply enough makeup to hide the thread marks that now covered her face and neck. But the red lines were too dark, too numerous to conceal completely. She had considered not attending the community meeting, but absence would be seen as admission of guilt. Karen had never backed down from a fight, and she wouldn't start now, even if the fight was already lost. The community center was packed when she arrived. Nearly every resident of Willowbrook had come to witness her public humiliation. Karen walked down the center aisle like a prisoner approaching the gallows, feeling the weight of dozens of hostile stares. Harold Martinez called the meeting to order from behind the folding table that served as the board's official podium. "We're here tonight to address the actions of former Vice President Karen Whitmore and vote on her permanent removal from the HOA board." The word former hit Karen like a physical blow. They had already decided her fate, reducing the entire meeting to theatrical formality. "Mrs. Whitmore, you have 5 minutes to address the community before we proceed to the vote," Harold announced with obvious reluctance. Karen stood slowly, her joints aching as if aged by decades in just a few days. As she turned to face the assembled residents, a murmur of shock rippled through the room. The thread marks on her face and neck were clearly visible despite her makeup efforts. "I stand by my actions," she began, her voice hoarse and strained. "This community has standards that must be maintained. Property values depend on—" Her words were cut off by a violent coughing fit that doubled her over at the podium. When she straightened up, something small and dark fell from her mouth onto the folding table. A black feather, wet with saliva and tinted with red. The room fell completely silent. Karen stared at the feather in horror, touching her throat where it felt like something was moving, scratching at her esophagus with tiny claws. "As I was saying," she continued. But another coughing spasm seized her. More feathers emerged, a steady stream of black plumage that scattered across the table like accusations given physical form. Someone in the audience screamed. Others began backing toward the exits. Karen tried to speak again, to explain what was happening, but only more feathers came out. Her voice was completely gone, replaced by the rustle of wings and the whisper of judgment. The overhead fluorescent lights began to flicker in rhythm with her coughing. With each pulse of illumination, Karen's shadow seemed to grow larger and more distorted, stretching across the wall behind her like dark wings. In the strobing light, witnesses later swore they saw Karen's pupils disappear entirely, leaving behind only white orbs that reflected the chaos of the room. She reached toward the crowd with hands that seemed to elongate like talons, her mouth opening impossibly wide to release a final torrent of black feathers. Then she collapsed. Karen Whitmore, former HOA vice president and self-appointed guardian of community standards, crumpled to the floor behind the folding table like a marionette with severed strings. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but they found no medical explanation for her condition. Karen was unconscious but breathing, her pulse steady but weak. The thread marks on her skin had faded to pale scars, and her mouth showed no signs of the feathers that dozens of witnesses had seen her expel. At the psychiatric facility, where she was eventually committed, doctors diagnosed her with a severe dissociative episode triggered by community stress and social isolation. They had no explanation for the scars that covered her body in intricate patterns, or for her complete inability to speak above a whisper. Karen's house was condemned by the city within a week of her hospitalization. Structural engineers found extensive damage throughout the building, as if the wooden framework had been systematically weakened by some unknown force. The foundation had mysterious cracks that formed geometric patterns, and black mold covered the interior walls, despite the building's relatively new construction. No one could explain how a well-maintained suburban home had deteriorated so rapidly. But the demolition crew reported strange phenomena during the teardown. Workers claimed their tools became inexplicably tangled in invisible threads, and several quit after hearing children's voices echoing from empty rooms. The dolls disappeared from the community fence the same night Karen collapsed at the meeting. Residents assumed someone had finally removed them, but no one admitted to the task. The fence posts, where they had hung, bore small scorch marks that couldn't be scrubbed away, and grass refused to grow in perfect circles around each post. The body positivity picnic was rescheduled for the following Saturday, and the turnout exceeded all expectations. Families from neighboring communities joined Willowbrook residents in a celebration of acceptance and mutual support. Jason Reeves was presented with a special recognition as Community Courage Award, recipient for his resilience in the face of adversity. Celeste Reeves provided homemade cookies and lemonade for the event, her gentle smile welcoming children and parents alike. She wore her small leather pouch as always, but those who looked closely noticed it seemed lighter somehow, as if some burden had been lifted from its contents. When a reporter from the local newspaper asked her about the strange events surrounding the dolls, Celeste simply smiled and touched her pouch gently. "Some folks don't understand that protecting children is the most sacred work there is," she said in her soft, low-country accent. "When you attack what's innocent and defenseless, the universe has ways of setting things right." The reporter pressed for more details about the supernatural aspects of the story, but Celeste just shook her head. "Ain't nothing supernatural about consequences, child. Some things are just older and deeper than we like to admit." In the months that followed, Willowbrook became known throughout the region as an exceptionally welcoming and inclusive community. Property values actually increased as families specifically sought out the neighborhood's reputation for acceptance and mutual support. The new HOA board, led by Linda Chen, implemented policies focused on community building rather than enforcement. Jason Reeves flourished in the supportive environment. His medical condition remained challenging, but the community's acceptance gave him confidence to participate in activities he had previously avoided. He joined the neighborhood's new youth council and became an advocate for children facing similar struggles. Sometimes, late at night, residents walking past the old fence posts reported hearing faint sounds, not threatening or frightening, but comforting somehow. The whisper of protective wings, the soft hum of ancient wisdom keeping watch over sleeping children. No one speaks Karen Whitmore's name anymore without instinctively reaching for wood to knock on, salt to throw, or whatever small protection their particular tradition provides. Because everyone in Willowbrook now understands, in ways they never had before, that some forces in this world are older and more powerful than suburban authority. And in a small psychiatric facility across town, a woman sits by her window, fingers moving in endless stitching motions through empty air. She cannot speak above a whisper, and her eyes hold the hollow look of someone who finally understands the true cost of cruelty. Sometimes the nurses find black feathers scattered around her bed in the morning, though no birds are allowed in the facility. When asked about them, Karen can only smile with lips that remember the taste of judgment and whisper words that sound like apologies she can never truly make. The children of Willowbrook sleep peacefully now, protected by love and community and forces that weave through the darkness like silver thread through midnight cloth. They dream of acceptance and possibilities, while somewhere in the shadows, a grandmother's ancient wisdom continues its eternal work of keeping innocence safe from those who would do it harm. And on clear nights, when the moon is full and the wind carries whispers of old songs across the suburban streets, residents sometimes see a figure walking slowly along the fence line, an elderly woman checking the invisible barriers that guard their children's dreams, ensuring that the darkness beyond stays exactly where it belongs.